Hello and welcome to the FC Construct video review of the DUNU SA6. Before we start, please note that I've linked a written version of this review in the description. You'll definitely want to read that because I'll cover a few things in there that aren't mentioned in this video. Also, I'd like to thank Tom and Kevin at DUNU for providing me this review unit. This video will be my honest thoughts on the DUNU SA6. I'm not compensated in any other way. Now, for those who may not know, the SA6 has gotten quite a bit of a following over the past year. It is an all BA IEM with 6 balanced armatures, so that's where the 6 comes from. And looking at the accessory set, you can see that you have actually 11 pairs of tips. So there's 10 right here and then another pair on the IEM itself. So you also get a quite nice carrying case. I think it's pretty minimalistic. It's a zipper case, and when you open it up, it's kind of opens up like this. There's a little pouch in here and a cable tie. You also get a little cleaning tool and your standard kind of 1/4 inch adapter. It actually says DUNU on here if it focuses. And then of course you get DUNU's kind of special DW03 cable, which has these interchangeable jacks. So you can actually let's see, you can pull these out. And you can, so this is a 3.5mm jack. You can change them for a 4.4 and a 2.5. Now this adapter only works for the 3.5mm. So you'll have to use that if you're going to use this adapter. But yeah, so this is pretty cool. The only thing I'd say is that this is made of plastic, which kind of, it'd be nice if this was made of metal, but that's such a minor nitpick. Anyway, so yeah, so that's a pretty cool cable system. For the cable itself, I am not a super big fan of it, just because you can see how kind of thick the braiding is on here, and I just find it's a little heavy for my liking. Now, one thing to note with this cable is that it uses a recessed 2-pin connector. So if you look at this IEM here, and let's see if I can focus, you can see how it has this recessed portion. But if you look at the cable, you can also see that there's a bit of a groove there. Do you see that groove? And so not every 2-pin cable will work with this IEM. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're going looking for aftermarket cables. Alright, so looking at the IEM itself, you can see that there's this tuning switch right at the very top. And by default, it's actually on the 1 position. I have it on the on position because I actually prefer that. Now, the nice thing about this IEM is that you don't have to use a special tool to actually flip the switch. You can actually just do it with your fingers like that. The shell, I think, is especially gorgeous. It has this transparent, smoky color and a stabilized wood faceplate. And from what I can tell, no two SA6s have the exact same faceplate because they differ in terms of color and the wood grain pattern. So on this one, you can see that it has a bit of a different wooden pattern as well. But the unfortunate part of that, I guess, is that when you actually order one of these, you aren't guaranteed to get necessarily the color or the pattern you want, and you won't know what it is like until you actually have it in your hand. But otherwise, a lot of the SA6s I've seen and the pictures that I've seen, they all look really, really nice, just like my pair does here. Moving on to the overall sound portion of this review, I'd like to say my first impression of the SA6 was that, well, simply, this is an all BA IEM. It really strikes me, having reviewed just a lot of hybrid IEMs over the past year and some really dynamic headphones like the Elex and the Clear recently, the full BA nature of the SA6 was, I think, the first thing that struck me. Not to say that it's bad, just something to keep in mind. And then I guess my second thought for this IEM is that, wow, the tuning is very, very nicely balanced. It has this smooth, forgiving sound signature to it. The bass is at a comfortable level. The mids are, they're lightly relaxed, and the treble has this sort of odd balance to it that I'll get into in the other parts of my review. The tuning switch at the top here adds a slight 1 to 2 decibel bass boost in the lower mids and bass, of course, when it's in the on position like this. And despite this minor bump in the low end, I actually find that it does a lot to change the sound of the bass response. Going from it's at the one position, it has a lighter sort of punch to it, whereas in the on position, it has almost like a weighty thump to the bass. The bass of the SA6 is what I would consider high quality BA bass. Where it lacks in that deep bodied bass response that you see in sort of high quality dynamic drivers like this Sony EX1000, it has that characteristic, fast decay accompanied by tight and reactive punchiness from the balanced armatures in this IEM. And I think what stands out to me about the SA6's low-end response is how well controlled it is. In my library, I have a few tracks that I listen to during reviews, and sometimes I can't really tell if it's the track itself that's poorly recorded or if the IEM itself, the headphone, can't keep up with it. And with the SA6, I never get the feeling that it fails to handle the track. It's always the recording itself that I find that might be the one that's lacking, not the IEM itself. And I think what's more impressive about the SA6 is that it does this without compromising on the low-end quantity. I find, some IEMs, they purposefully keep the bass down so that they can maintain that sense of control, but the SA6 doesn't need to do that. The bass, I find, does not bleed into the mids, and there is no hint of muddiness or bloat in this IEM. So really, I think that's the mark of a good quality bass response. So with the tuning of the SA6, on the stock 1 position, as you can see on here, it has a bass response that I think leans towards the punchy side. I find that it is light, and it gives a really sort of a clean cut low end that doesn't sound sterile at all actually. Now on the on position, DUNU actually calls this the atmospheric position. I don't really know what that means, but I can tell you what it translates into is that it goes from a lean and sort of punchy bass to a more weightier and thumpier sort of sound. And I will say that while this transformation isn't very dramatic necessarily, I think it really adds a whole different dimension to the SA6's sound, and most people will definitely prefer one or the other. I myself personally prefer it on the on position because I find that it adds just that bit of bass oomph to it, to the sound, and really compensates for the nature of that BA bass. Of course, my only complaint would be the lack of a real substantial DD-like sub-bass rumble and impact, but you can't really complain. That's just the nature of the IEM. Otherwise, I think the SA6's bass response, I think, is nicely spread across the whole low-end spectrum. It doesn't sound like it centers around, say, the mid-bass or the upper mid-bass. I find that other IEMs that try for a fast punchy sound or a deep rumble, they get too pigeonholed in either the mid-bass or the sub-bass, and they kind of give up on the other parts of the bass range, whereas the SA6 doesn't necessarily do that, which gives it a very nice balanced response overall. I would say that the mids of the SA6 are tonally pleasing and smooth. I don't get a sense of incoherency as the bass transitions into the lower mids, and though typically I find that a lot of IEMs can struggle in that tricky region, with the SA6 the notes are very well defined in that area. Tuning wise, while the SA6 certainly isn't lean, I wouldn't call it warm either. There isn't an elevation in the lower mids that gives rise to what I would call warmth or lush sort of sound, and there's a lot of upper mids in this IEM to really counterbalance that. And speaking of the upper mids, I find it to be at a tasteful volume. It isn't so much that it sounds overly forward or shouty, but it's not recessed and hidden so that other instruments kind of overtake it and causes vocals to be hidden or smothered. Vocals are nicely positioned right front and center, and going with the smooth story on this IEMs, there isn't any hint of sibilance or harshness on here. I also don't really detect any sort of peakiness that might put someone off. I find that the instrument tone on this IEMs is excellent. At least with the mids, the SA6 doesn't have that BA timbre at all, and so I have no complaints here. And I think really, like every other great sounding IEM, the mids really needs to be a foundation, and the SA6 has really nailed your mid-range. I have nothing to complain about. The treble of the SA6 is pretty unique. It's non-fatiguing and easy to listen to, but I find that it doesn't try to hide away in the mix. It's actually fully present. It's at the same time, it's also very forgiving of poor recordings. Listening to hats and cymbals, I can hear that the initial attack is partly muted, and that crisp sound is, it's not fully resolved, but you do hear that back end sizzle that comes out with more prominence. And I think that really gives the illusion of having a very lively and unabated treble response without any fatigue. When you look at the frequency response graph, and I'll get into this a bit later, you can kind of actually see why this is the case. There's a gap between the 5K and 7K mark, and there's actually a pretty big dip right in that region there. And what that leads to is that, that dip actually kind of cuts out a lot of that lower treble area, but that subsequent elevation on the back end in the mid treble gives rise to that clear presence that isn't hidden away, but it also doesn't sound aggressive because you sort of cut out that lower treble. And what's really nice about that strategy is that you avoid a lot of the pain points for sibilance and harshness around that 5K, 6K region that, at least personally, I find to be common for sibilance. And while I'm personally a fan of having crisp hat and cymbals, and the SA6 doesn't, kind of cuts that out a little bit, I'm fine with that because, for the most part, instrument timbre is still mostly preserved. And other than the hats and cymbals, I would say that the other common instrument that you're likely hear that's affected by this tuning strategy is the snare. The sharp crack of the snare actually has a bit of energy around this exact 5, 6K, 7K region, and that dip kind of cuts into that. So you hear more of the low end body of the snare in the mix rather than that sharp crack sound. And so it does give a little bit of an interesting flavor to the overall IEM, and I personally didn't think I'd like it so much, but yeah, it works very well. My only nitpick with the treble on the SA6 is that I wish there was more upper treble extension to give more air and brilliance, but I think that's a complaint that I have with almost every IEM I've listened to. Soundstage and imaging on the SA6 I would say to be on the good side of average. It's about what I would expect for a mid-fi, but it's nothing to really write home about. I would say as good width with a little bit of height and a bit of depth. It's pretty standard for what good IEMs should be. Imaging I would also consider to be pretty solid. Instruments are well separated, they're properly defined, and there's a bit of this layering effect going on that positions instruments such that they never feel congested or that you're fighting for space on the soundstage. So spacing and staging I think is an upside on this IEM, but nothing to write home about. Resolution on the SA6 I think is about as good as you're going to get until you really hit top tier levels. I personally find in terms of at least resolution or just in technical performance in general, IEMs kind of have a sort of a plateau system where you have this would be like a good mid-fi IEM, and then tiers where you have hi-fi, and I don't really find a lot of IEMs exist in this sort of region here. I would consider the SA6 to be at the top of this mid-fi plateau, and while it doesn't reach top of the line status, it's very, very good, and I can't really ask for more, to be honest. I would say that the only nitpick I have on the technical side of these IEMs is that it has a bit of a diminished dynamics. When I'm listening to a track and I'm waiting for a drop, basically, or I know there's gonna be a part with really soaring vocals, the SA6 seems to hit a bit of a wall where, it goes up and it kind of hits that peak and it doesn't really truly get to that peak. It kind of hits a wall and then it comes down again. To be fair though, I think this complaint you could really extend to almost every IEM on the market, except for those that are truly outstanding. All in all, the SA6's technical performance is about as, like I said, as good as you're going to get for the price tag of $550. I don't think it's, the absolute winner in terms of price to performance. I think that title would probably go to the Moondrop Blessing 2. Well, I haven't actually heard that IEM. Just based on its reputation, it seems like it's going to be very hard to beat that. But in terms of, the mid-fi landscape, this is really just a very strong player. Just before we approach the final section of this review, I'd like to take a moment to look at the frequency response of the DUNU SA6. On the screen, you'll see that I have my own SA6 graphed, and we're looking at the right channel and the left channel compared on the on switch position. And right away you can see that there is a little bit of channel imbalance. I would not be concerned about this. This is at a level that you will not be able to tell in your ears. I certainly can't. Switching over to the view with the SA6 on the on position versus the one position, you'll see that there is a boost in the bass and lower mids of about 1 to 2 decibels. And so this is the effect of the tuning switch. Like I said, there doesn't look to actually be that much of a difference. It's very close, but the effect in your ears is that you go from a lean, sort of punchy sound to a more weighty and thumpier sound. And personally, I think that I like the thumpier, weighted sound more. Sweeping on the graph from left to right, going from the bass to the treble, we can see that the SA6 has a healthy amount of bass elevation. So that gives it a balanced, sort of not overly bassy, but good presence in the bass region. That sort of starts to taper off around the 200 to 300 Hertz mark, where the bass transitions into the lower mids. Looking at the mids now, from the 200-300 Hertz mark all the way up to around 4K, you can see that very nice mid-range that the SA6 has. It has a pin-up peak around the 2.5-2.6K mark, which is pretty close to ideal. You can see why it's not overly forward or overly shouty, just because of how gentle that sort of slope up is. Note that a lot of these graphs, you look at it around the 1K mark, but in your ears, that's, your ears don't set at around 1K. So just use it as a very relative rough sort of guide, but don't use it as an absolute. One thing you'll note is that as you start going up to the 4.5, 5K mark, you will see now you're hitting that treble region, and you can clearly see that big dip I was talking about in the lower treble. But right after that dip, the treble shoots all the way up again at the 7 to 8K mark, and that really gives you that treble presence without the lower treble energy and fatigue. And that, I think, is what makes the treble of this IEM pretty unique. If you actually compare this IEM to QDC top of the line, they actually have very similar tunings. But I can tell you, having listened to the QDC 8SH in the past, they definitely don't sound alike. And just to finish the conversation about the frequency response, if you look past that sort of 8K mark and go all the way up to the 20K mark, you can see that, the upper treble dips down quite a bit. I would say that you should be cautious when you look at the frequency response in this upper region, as it starts to get a little dodgy. I use it more as a check to see how much kind of air there is in this IEM. And from what I heard and from what I can see on the graph here, it sort of confirms my suspicions that this IEM isn't a super airy or brilliant IEM up top. So I think that concludes the tour of the frequency response. You can see that the SA6, in my opinion, I've looked at the graph after I heard it for about 2 weeks, and it kind of came out to sort of what I would expect. I didn't expect this much of a dip in the 5-6K region, because to my ears, it's not as if all the lower treble energy is sort of like deleted. It actually, a lot of it is still there, and the graph to me is slightly misleading in the sense that it looks like it's completely gone, but really there's still plenty of energy still there. It's just partly muted so that it's not fatiguing. So now we come to my favorite part of the reviews that I write, and that is the should you buy it section. To put it simply, yes, I think that the DUNU SA6 is worth its $550 price tag. I think it is just simply a very, very, very good IEM. And while it doesn't do anything necessarily groundbreaking, I do think that every part of this IEM comes together beautifully, from its shell to the accessories that it has, to the tuning switch that it has that is meaningful. Not a lot of IEMs can actually say that. Its bass is very well controlled. Its mids is smoothed and balanced out. Its treble is unique but just works quite well. And I think that very few IEMs have a package this robust. And I think that's what the SA6 really brings to the table. And it's not to say that there aren't any other mid-fi IEMs out there that aren't worth the $550 price tag or whatever they may be in their price range. I just think that the SA6 really reaffirms or has reset the bar to which good mid-fi IEMs should strive for. From what I can see, the DUNU SA6 faces two threats. The first is the Moondrop Blessing. Like I said, I have not heard that IEM, but my guess is that the SA6 can't beat it in terms of sheer price to performance. That IEM is about $200 cheaper than the SA6, and frankly, it's just hard to beat that, especially at how good its reputation is. That being said, there's always a few arguments you could make back and forth in terms of which IEM you should buy. And one of the big, I think, winners with the SA6 is how small and comfortable it is. I've heard, reports that people have a hard time fitting the Blessing 2 just because of how large the nozzle sizes are and kind of how large the IEM is itself. The second challenge that I think the SA6 has is that it has that relative lack of special sauce. And I think that makes it susceptible to being replaced by other IEMs in the future. That said, whether those hypothetical IEMs will ever exist is a question in and of itself, and that doesn't detract from the value that the SA6 brings to the table. Whether or not those IEMs exist, the SA6 is still a very good IEM. I think to put things in perspective, in fact, just on that note, is that I would actually probably take the SA6 over the T-Audio Clairvoyance. I know that might be a little controversial, but I think that just based on the price and just the better fit of the SA6, I think it's worth my money more. To me, the Clairvoyance also suffers a bit of the same problem in that it's very, very good, but I just don't think it does anything super unique. And so here comes the DUNU SA6 that does a very similar job in being a very well-tuned, very balanced IEM. And this IEM even has better comfort, it's cheaper, and to an extent I like the treble on this IEM more. It has better presence and just a better feel to it. That being said, of course, I think the T-Audio Monarch is actually still safe because of its very unique sub-bass response and sort of its aggressive treble forwardness to it that still sets it apart from the Clairvoyance. And so just to conclude this review, I think that the DUNU SA6 is a very easy recommendation for the $550 mark. Just whoever is looking in the mid-5 price range, this will probably be my go-to IEM. It has gotten a lot of reviews over the past. I think I'm probably one of the very last reviewers looking at this IEM at this point. But, that said, I think that this is an IEM that has rightfully earned its praise across all of those reviews. Hype trains, I think sometimes, they take off from the station, but whether or not they actually reach the destination or not is a whole separate issue in itself. With the SA6, I think it has reached its destination and has done so with great fanfare. I'm really glad I had a chance to review this review, and I really hope that DUNU keeps up the good work making IEMs like this. Only time will tell, I think, if DUNU is a one-trick pony and this is the only good IEM they're going to release in the next few years. But I'm really hoping that a lot of the R&D efforts will play out well and we'll get a lot of better and better IEMs from them. And that brings us to the end of this video review. I hope you enjoyed it. Like I said at the start, I'll include the link to the written version of this review in the description below. Once again, please do read that review. It will present the content in a different way. And I think you will just get a more comprehensive overview of this IEM from that. Thanks, and I'll see you next time.